Dave Parody here with another Slide Makeover video podcast based on the ideas in my book, The Visual Slide Revolution. Today we're going to talk about how do we show comparisons. Now, the challenge is sometimes that we make comparisons way too complex. Here's the slide that we're looking at today. So what this is we're looking at three different areas, the red, the blue, and the green area, and we're looking at the number of transactions they did, the revenue, and then the profit, which is in financial terms or accounting terms EBITDA, which is the term that they use. So what we're trying to do here is to look at red, blue, and green, which is kind of doing better than the others. And what's happened here is that we expect the audience to actually figure it out from these three graphs. Now, at least we've used graphs, not a whole pile of numbers. That's nice, except they're very confusing. Here's the point that they're trying to make, actually, just in case you haven't figured it out. If you look at the little green pie wedge, in the number of transactions, it's 5%. And in the revenue, it's 8.6%. Now, the conclusion you're supposed to reach from there is that we get a higher percentage of our revenue from the green than we do from the others when you compare it to the number of transactions, because the pie wedge is bigger compared to what the number of transactions is. Now, if that's confusing, don't worry. It's confusing for most people, unless you really can do math in your head. And by the way, that's not going to happen. With your audiences, this is really difficult to try to figure out. And so the challenge here is how do we make this easy to understand? And we make it easy to understand by figuring out how can we present the point, the message, with a common denominator. A common denominator being we're trying to compare a certain value. In this case, it's going to be revenue and profit, EBITDA, per transaction. That allows us to have a common base that we compare everything to. Let me show you the slide that I created. Headline, green generates higher revenue and EBITDA per transaction. Now see, that's the key message we wanted to get across, and you wouldn't have ever figured that out by just looking at those three pie charts. Now I need to prove or visually show this result, this headline. So first graph, let's take a look at revenue per transaction. We look at red, blue, and green. Red, almost $25. Blue, just over $23. But green, over $43 revenue per transaction. So you can see green is getting a lot more out of every transaction. But does that translate to the bottom line? Well, let's look at the profit or EBITDA per transaction. Red, almost $3.62. Blue, over $6 per transaction. So you see blue gets a lot more profit per transaction than red does, even though the revenue is slightly lower. Green, just a penny shy of $8 per transaction. So clearly what the green group is doing is something that we need to investigate, figure out how they're able to get greater revenue and profit out of every single transaction. So you see what we've done here is we've made it very easy for our audience to visualize and to see what the comparison is by bringing all of the information down to a common denominator here per transaction. So what lessons can we learn from today's makeover? Well, just a reminder, more information on the book, www.visualsliderevolution.com. More information on my customized training workshops, consulting, video resources, other free resources for you, www.ThinkOutsideTheSlide.com. So our lessons today for using a common denominator for comparisons. Probably the biggest lesson that I share with people is do not expect your audience to do math, because they won't. They will not do math in their heads during the presentation live. It's not going to happen. We can't just throw up numbers, or in this case graphs, and expect people to do the math. You have to do the math. So what do you do? First, determine what is that best denominator per X. Here it was per transaction. What's the best one to use? That's not always obvious. Sometimes you have to think about it for a bit, but figure out what that is and then recalculate all of the values that you want to present, again, based on what that key message is, on a per X basis. In this case, per transaction. So we did revenue and profit per transaction, and then use a very simple graph to show those differences on that common denominator basis. Now the audience easily understands your point, easily understands the message, and they won't be confused by data or graphs. So when you are looking to do comparisons, especially with numbers, don't confuse the audience. Use the lessons in this makeover to Figure out what that common denominator should be and show a simple representation that makes it easy for the audience to understand your message. This has been Dave Parody with another Slide Makeover video podcast.